Okay, it looks like we're now streaming live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. For some reason, the transition is a little bit less seamless than it was in our last technological innovation. But that's okay. Today, I'm interviewing Kimberly Unger, who has been a discussant on the show many times.
Yep.
But I'm excited to talk to you today, Kimberly, because Kimberly has a book coming out. Woo! And I have read this book. Shh, don't tell.
Which is even better.
I think it's probably even better than it was when I read it, but it's a cool book.
It should be.
Coming out November 13th from
Right.
Tachyon Press.
Right.
And it's called Nucleation.
Yes.
And so the first thing I'm going to ask you is, why is it called Nucleation?
So it's called Nucleation because everything sort of coalesces around this original incident, right? Is there's this sort of an inciting incident at the beginning, and the whole story sort of comes together around that moment over time. And then it sort of cross touches onto, the nanomachines that are used to create deep space objects, and that sort of serve as a sort of a subtext of creation and destruction throughout the story, of the way things come together and the way things get pulled apart again. So nucleation it is.
Cool. So that's like a chemistry?
It is.
Yeah.
It is. You know, when you do the Mentos experiment, everybody knows the Mentos experiment, right? You take a Mentos and you drop it in 2 liters of Coke and you get this fountain.
Yeah.
And the reason it works with these two products is because of the nucleation points on the Mentos. The fact that those are not smooth surfaces, but if you look at it under a microscope, that surface is very jagged, and there's lots of points where those bubbles can coalesce and form on those mints, and that's sort of what triggers this explosive reaction. So I am cross applying that to my universe.
So what we really are looking at here is a Mentos explosion in space.
There we go.
I'm already super excited. I want to read it again now. Okay, well, that's kind of fun. So the premise of the book is that there is a deep space probe. Is this a probe, or is it just a project?
It's a probe. So that the concept is, or the high idea is, that space travel is dangerous and it is expensive. And instead of putting people in pods and flinging them into deep space, or working with colony ships or generation ships, the idea was, how would you send robots first? Right,
Okay.
it's sort of what we do now, right? We're sending electronic probes, we're sending rovers, we're sending machines out ahead of us. So if you had to get way out there, how are you going to do that if you're going to send the robots first? And then the people can follow later, which is what this whole project is about.
Sure.
Right? Is they're sending the robots first. But in order to get those aha moments, in order to get those weird random cross connections, you've got to have a person riding along. And so the core concept is, what if we get out there far enough where our explorers, our exploratory robots, run into somebody else's who's thinking along the same lines, or who's operating along the same lines. And, with 2 possibly wildly different technologies and wildly different methodologies, how do you recognize each other? How do you know, we could go to, Enceladus, for example, in our own solar system, but how would we recognize what is, outside of our particular limitations? How do you recognize something that's alive if it's not, made of meat or made of plant or that kind of thing? So
sure. That's interesting. Okay, so one of the pieces that I think that we haven't quite said is, you've said that there are these robots, and you've also said that you need to have a human observer, but you haven't actually told us what the means for that is. And it's not something that nobody's ever seen before, which I think, since it's not this technology is not the fundamental question of the whole book. The question of the whole book is actually way more interesting than that. This is the first a piece of the premise, right?
Right.
And is Waldo the standard name for that? Because it's like a human consciousness controlled robot.
Right.
Where the humans, like, perceptions are kind of based in that robot. Correct.
So it is essentially it's had a lot of names in science fiction, right? It's been called telepresence. These days we call it virtual reality or augmented reality. The idea being that a person's consciousness or a person's intelligence is riding along with and puppeteering a remote object, which can be in any number of configurations, right? And in this particular case, we're using quantum communication. So the idea being that as part of the package that creates or builds a robot when it gets out into space, there is a particle or a small set of particles that is entangled to a particle that is left back in the lab. And so once all of that gets constructed, you can then connect a person directly and have near instantaneous communication. And that lets you, right now when we run our rovers on Mars, there's a lag, right? You deliver your instructions, the instructions go out, and it takes several minutes to get there.
Yeah.
The rover executes the instructions, and then it takes several minutes for the information to come back. So it is a very slow and measured process.
Yeah.
Which is not as exciting as
it doesn't make for as good a science fiction like
exactly. So I am taking some liberties with the capabilities, and I am goosing it a little bit to make it a little more fun, right? Than it might otherwise be. But that gives us our ability to operate machinery in real time, and still make those sort of weird adjustments that people make that even our current version of AIs don't quite get their heads around.
Yeah.
So it's like telepresence robots using Ansible technology to control them.
Very much so, yes.
Nice.
Yes, it's very cool, Paul. It's very cool. And it also reminds me of that science fictional concept that was not originated in the movie Avatar, but was, used by that movie. And I cannot remember the original short story. I think it's called My Name is Joe or something, where the person is remote Waldoing like a person-sized entity of some kind on an alien planet.
Sure.
But so it has some of that same vibe, where you've got a whole set of problems that could be had on one end, and then another whole set of problems that can be had on another end,
right?
Where the tenuous connection between this robot and what it's doing and the human and the decisions that the human is making and everything else. And one of the coolest things about this book is that interface, right? Where, when technically speaking, we're like, well, it's just a pair of entangled particles, right? But what you're really dealing with is you've got this whole world on the other end, and then you've got the whole world on this end, and they really don't jive together well, and they cause each other lots of problems.
Exactly. There's a disconnect, right?
Yeah.
And it's a, you know, it's, and in world or in context, it does eventually cause problems for people who do this, right? Is you get that disconnect between, you know, the world sort of back at their lab versus the world that they are operating, you know, billions of miles away in space. And it's done at different levels. There are people who have different levels of capability, different levels of immersion. But that break or that ability to disassociate is a very real threat. The longer you do this type of work, it gets, you know, it gets trickier, right, over time.
Well, so this is the kind of psychological question that I find really fascinating. And I'm so glad to see that being dealt with on a level in a story. It's like, you know, we're not just going to go out and do a thing, but we're also going to be like, yeah, we're doing these things, we're having these problems, we're also trying to cope with the fact that we're still human beings trying to do this.
Right.
And I think you got a lot of really interesting wrinkles in there that are not the usual wrinkles. So, so I think this is a really cool story.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things, you know, a lot of people presume that working in the virtual, right, working in virtuality, working with some kind of telepresence is a get out of jail free card, right? That, okay, whatever happens on the other end doesn't affect you, you know, in the real world. But the truth of the matter is it does. You know, you know, your brain is surprisingly easily fooled. You know, even in our current state of virtual reality, it's very easy to for people to make a misstep, for people to for that input just through the eyes to be so strong that you know, it overrides what they know. Right. You may know that you're sitting in a living room and that there's a wall, you know, less than arm's reach out to your right, but based on what's coming in through your headset, you may try to reach out past that wall anyway, even though you know better. Right. Because that driver is very strong, and the visual cortex is one of the most powerful drivers for our reactions and for our you know, for our ability to operate ourselves. And if you take that ability and separate it from your body and are using it to operate you know, a robot somewhere, and you're doing, you know, motion mapping, right, where your fingers are operating controls and your arms and all these motions are make a difference. You know, mapping all that back to your own body takes a few minutes. You know, it takes a little while to sort of get used to that. And, you know, you hear people even in like, if you're talking to artists, right, who work in Photoshop and they spend hours and hours staring at a screen, and you'll sometimes hear them joke about the fact that, you know, if they make a mistake in the real world, in their mind, they still go through, you know, hitting edit undo or control Z to go back a step. Even though it doesn't actually do anything, they can feel that click in their head, right? Because you've programmed that action in, like, oh, made a mistake, click, go back one, right? Control Z.
Yeah.
But, you know, but it you know, I mean, it doesn't work in the real world, obviously, but you still feel that impulse kick every time it happens.
Yeah. So one of the things that I have found really interesting to talk to you about in your process is you have a really interesting sense of the role of science in your work and how important it is. And you, I'm not going to say struggle, because that would imply you're having difficulty, but you definitely recognize the challenge of balancing the accuracy of the science with the quality of the story. Would you care to comment on that as it applies to this book?
So when I did the first draft of this book, I leaned very heavily into real science. There's a lot of basis in reality for the technology that I use and sort of the methodologies that are outlined in the book. There are some hand waves, obviously, to science fiction, right? Quantum communication doesn't actually quite work the way that I'm using it in the book, for example. But as I went through iterations, I eventually had to make the choices of what pieces of the science helped move the story forward and what were just sort of me showing off how much research I'd done.
Yeah.
So, because there's a lot of cool stuff out there. And you really want people to see the depths of how cool it is, but it's very easy to get bogged down narratively as well. So there's definitely a large stack of things that got taken out simply because, they are realistic and they are the way things would operate in the real world, but they don't improve the story at all, right? Having to worry about working with everybody having a different brand of hardware, for example, and the poor IT guy losing his crap trying to get them all to talk together is an entertaining side story, but it doesn't really drive the main narrative forward the way that I needed it to for this particular book.
Yeah, I hear you.
How else does your day job, which works with virtual reality platforms, help inform your world building for the virtual reality in this book?
So there's definitely not anywhere near as much heaviness on the technology in the book as the kinds of things that I see at work. VR, by and large, is farther along than people think it is. It's in this weird place where you have to see it to believe it. Really, once you put on a VR headset, you will understand it. The way that it works, and you will understand the reason it's so compelling for a lot of people. But until you do that, your idea of virtual reality is going to be fed by movies like, Virtuosity and, some of the stuff like Neuromancer, which, were kind of big in the 80s, but we haven't really gotten into now. And even stuff like The Oasis now really doesn't quite touch on the experience of operating in virtual reality. I think it'll get there. So bridging the gap between the way people think of what you can do in VR versus what you can actually do in VR was a bit of an interesting challenge, right? One of the things I run into in the science is making those cross connections between sort of I always think of this as the difference between illustration and photography, right? If you look at, a photo of, a house by the lake and a painting of a house by a lake, they're representing the same thing, but they're a little bit different, right? And so what I really need to do for the science and the virtual reality is to speak to what people have in their heads about virtual reality, as opposed to necessarily speaking to the literal actual virtual reality that I can access at work. Fortunately, my day job kind of puts me at that intersection point anyway. So I do a lot of building metaphor as sort of part of my day-to-day job. So I have a lot of practice.
Nice.
Interesting. So really what you're talking about is the narratives that people have internalized about virtual reality and the expectations that has created in a reader's mind.
Right.
And how to articulate with that as a person who's trying to maybe access that narrative and bring it to a different place. Would you say that's part of your hope in this environment?
Absolutely. And it's, touching on people's internal narratives and making those connections to the reader,
Mm-hmm.
It improves the story, right? When people talk about going from reading the book to watching the movie, right? And, oh, this actor isn't quite right. And, oh, I thought it would look this place would look different, or that place would look different.
Yeah.
Getting readers to invoke their own personal experience and invoke their own internal narratives adds depth to the story from their personal point of view.
Right. Yeah. I'm over here writing my notes, as I do.
That's always the awkward bit,
I'm writing down what Kimberly is saying. My hand.
I do that in meetings all the time.
I guarantee it. But cool. Okay, so cool. And I would like you to tell us a little bit about the world you set this in, because it's sort of our world, but like every version of our world in science fiction is a little different.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you could tell us about that. And then
Sure.
From there, we can go on to talking about some of the characters. I think that might be fun.
Awesome. So the world is not Earth per se. It's a colony, and I'm deliberately a little bit vague about where it is and what the specifics are. And because I wanted to focus on that connection between the characters, here and the
Mm-hmm.
characters as they are sort of out in deep space. So it is Earth-like. It is a version of Earth where you could draw a line from our Earth now to this Earth in the
Mm-hmm.
future. One of the key differences I made, and part of this is because I work in tech, is I'm looking at these kinds of exploration, and I'm looking at these companies that operate these remote systems
Mm-hmm.
as, what if we went to space? What if, and we're on the verge of doing this now, obviously, what if that was driven from a more sort of tech mindset, or a more move fast and break things kind of mindset? And that's one of the places where this idea of using telepresence and having the robots go first comes from, because when you're moving fast and breaking things, you don't want to risk human lives doing it. So you're going to find a path that's less risky to the people. Elon Musk practically blows up spaceships for fun.
Mm-hmm.
And you can do that because there's no people on them, right? Once you bring human lives into the equation, then everything becomes very, very precious.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to push forward quickly under those circumstances, right? So I started thinking about this future built from this idea that that human lives are important enough where we lean into the technology to do the testing, and we lean into just, burning a certain amount of resources so we can get it right, so that when we do send the people out there, it's going to be a greater chance of success on the first try, as opposed to the older school science fiction idea of putting people in rocket ships and firing them at distant planets.
Sure.
And letting them deal with what they find when they get there.
Yeah.
So it is a future variant of now, I think.
Yeah.
Which I think has turned out reasonably well with regards to
well, it feels very familiar and like, I know how this is going to work. You know, and to a degree, that's really important, right? Because especially when you're dealing with stuff that's like super cutting edge and space exploration, there's going to be a lot of stuff that people don't know.
Yep.
So it's really great to have this environment that keeps you feeling grounded and keeps you feeling like you know parameters that, you know,
Right.
hey, I know some of how this is going to work. And it frees you up, right, to enjoy the other parts.
Exactly. It you can use your own experiences as the foundation. It's not so far out there.
So picking up on the Elon Musk comment, so this is kind of a corporate based setting rather than like a NASA based setting. Right. So this is not the sort of the space program.
Right.
This is company A is trying X, Y, or Z, but company B and company C are also out there, maybe trying to do the same thing, maybe trying to, you know, see if they could piggyback on you if you tell them too much. Maybe like, so it's an interesting sort of, it's an interesting environment because it's got that sort of
Corporate intrigue
side. Yeah. And it's not, you know, it's not one of these narratives. It feels very sort of almost, gosh, this is the wrong word, but like postmodern, because a lot of the sort of golden age space narratives were based on the idea that if you went to space, you were going to do it via a space program. Right. Or like a planetary or at least a country-based space program. Whereas this is more of a corporate-based, you know, you could sort of see the SpaceX and those guys sort of extrapolated forward into an interesting possible future.
And into positions of rivalry with each other, if I'm reading the lines correctly here.
Yes.
Yeah, space. Yeah. So if Elon Musk had rivals and they were constantly trying to undercut each other as they're both trying to push into space.
Exactly. Well, I think you can get that, and part of the reason you can get that here is because it's a mature world. You know, you don't see Bezos and Musk going after each other right now because there's only two of them and it's too early. Right. You know, give those two corporations another 20 years of getting into space, and then maybe you're going to see some, you know, pushing back and forth. But right now, more space is better space as far as sort of the corporate mindset is concerned, right? The rising tide is going to lift everybody because they're going to need those extra resources. They're going to need people who can build rocket engines and gaskets and all these different pieces. But eventually they're going to go the way eventually the corporate mindset will ultimately dominate, and there's going to start being jockeying for position, and, you know, who's going to be number one in the space and who's going to be number two in the space.
Yeah. And,
you know, and those tend to last a generation, maybe two, right? There are some exceptions. But a lot of times, you know, the companies that were on top, you know, when I was a kid, you know, it was IBM. Everything was all IBM. They were like the gold standard for everything. And now, you know, they're a standard, but they're no longer sort of the top of the, you know, the top of the food chain anymore. Somebody else has stepped up, and eventually somebody else will reach beyond them, right?
See, I think one of the things that makes this really interesting is your insights into that kind of corporate culture and the history of how that kind of stuff has developed. And so, you know, that goes into your extrapolation faculties. Let's put that into the extrapolation box. And
there we go.
Yeah. Cool. So tell us about the protagonist.
So the protagonist, you know, I had to make some decisions with regards to the protagonist. And originally she was going to very much be an underdog, right? Coming up the corporate ladder, coming up from below the ranks. But it was far more interesting to make her a rock star battling for position than it was to have her climbing up from the mailroom, as it were, right?
Okay.
By bringing her in as an expert and then basically knocking her legs out from under her, and getting her to recover from that and to grow, right? Because she previously was of a very sort of one-track mindset with regards to her career, with regards to her role, with regards to, how she fits in the system. And, coming to the understanding that she could do something different that was maybe still informed by who she was and what she'd been doing was a more interesting story to me than just the, hey, I'm going to, work my way to the top, which is kind of where a lot of these narratives sort of go. I think that,
in the sort of corporate worldview type narrative that that's pretty common. I want to prove myself to the higher ups and advance and
yeah, exactly. Right? I want room service. But it was, it was more interesting to sort of take her off her pedestal, and sort of force her to rejigger how she thinks about things and what her plans are going to be. Which worked out pretty well, I think.
Yeah. Very cool. So what's her name?
This is her name is Helena Viktorovich.
Helena Viktorovich. Is there any particular logic behind that choice?
The last name is simply because of sort of the gravitas of it and the way it sounds in my head, really. And there's a bit of a nod to sort of the historic Russian presence in the space program. The reason they included Chekhov in Star Trek, right, was that nod to the Russian space programs. And so, in this variation of the future, a lot of that's gotten mashed together. So it's not unusual to see last names that pop up sort of out of type anyway. And then, Helen is actually my grandmother's name, and I've been looking for a place to use it. And, when I started, there was a little bit of a sort of a Helen of Troy idea there, but that sort of went by the wayside as the character evolved.
Okay.
In that, the character really, once I'd established that the character was going to start on the top rather than coming up from the bottom, she really grounded herself in sort of this self-made individual idea. So the name stuck, but the high concept did not.
That's cool.
And it was better. It's a better story for it, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great story. So yay, everybody should go read it, right? For sure. Okay, so let's see. Tell me about the social context, the sort of the social context of Helen and the people around her. I'm thinking about the diversity of the crew that she works with and the interesting sort of interactions between her and the people who are her support network, as it were. Sure. That's a really interesting part of the book, so I'd love to hear more about it.
Absolutely. Well, I do have a love of meritocracies, or the idea of meritocracies, right? Kind of the way that Roddenberry liked the idea of a utopia, even though everybody knows that a utopia doesn't really quite work. Right. I like the idea of people rising to their level of capability and their competence. So, the characters were written first for their merits, and then they were flavored sort of on top of that. So the personality elements, the things they love, the ways they react to stress, or the way they react to, you know, to other people, that tends to get flavored from there. But, you know, a far enough out future, you know, a lot of things have gotten sort of mashed up, and a lot of things have gotten cross-adopted. And, you know, I tried to stay away from leaning into that too heavily, because it's a hard mix to hit.
Adopted, do you mean across cultures within our, you know, our current concept of what subcultures of humanity are? Is that what you're saying?
To a certain degree, yeah. I mean, the longer you go, the more sort of mashed up things to get, right? So the pancake recipe that I use, actually, no, the taco recipe that I use that was handed down from my grandfather has come through many different hands. And so it is almost definitely not the secret family recipe that it started out 3 or 4 generations ago.
Right.
So it's been passed from person to person. And as such, it's, you know, it's gotten modified, and the spices have changed, and okay, you have to deep fry the corn tortillas in, you know, a mixture of, you know, this kind of lard and this kind of oil versus, oh, you're just going to use corn oil. And there's all of these variations that happen because of what's at the local supermarket, and you know, is your grandma Betty coming over? Because if she sees that you didn't use Crisco, you're in trouble, right? And she's never going to accept it, no matter how tasty it is. And so I was taking that and then extrapolating it out several hundred years. You know, there are names left, and there are you know, favorite elements left here and there. But I think a lot of things are going to sort of evolve in a new direction. But I wanted to give nods to the depth of the sort of all of the pieces that went into the soup. But it's, you know, one of the things I've always had a love-hate relationship with is sort of this idea that, you know, and you see this in The Expanse, and Walter John Williams has tackled it in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. This idea that, you know, you get out, you get on a space station, you get in a colony, and you have to pay for everything, including like the air, right? There's an air tax, and there's a water tax, and all of these different elements. And so the substructure that built this culture sort of started there with this idea that every piece is owned by somebody, or that every piece is created by somebody. And then I tried to sort of file the controls off, right? So, okay, when this colony first started, you had to pay for air, you had to pay for water, you had to pay for your nanobots. And then over time, these things evolved into rights as opposed to privileges. But, you know, through that process, you end up with a sort of as opposed to a single unified, you know, governmental system, you end up with this sort of classic cyberpunk set of nation states that are corporate based, right? So because Helen works with far reaches in particular, all of her hardware, all of her gear, all of her software experience base and everything is with that monoculture, right? And when she was working at Animus previously, she was deeply embedded in that particular monoculture. And so the sort of that early idea that everything is encapsulated and everything is created sort of led to these, the psychological ability for people to buy into their company or to buy into their particular vertical, which sort of forms the basis for the structure Helen has to operate within, where the operators are dealt with in sort of a chairs system, sort of the same way you see in an orchestra, right? So your top operators are the top performers, but you can be taken out of a top spot by somebody who performs better than you, right? And in some orchestras, you compete for chair positions, for first chair, second chair, that sort of thing, and you climb the ranks that way. And so Helen is operating in sort of a first chair position, which means that everybody is looking for, no matter how popular it is, no matter how well she makes friends, people are still always looking to take her down a peg. And so the support structure she has is as important to maintaining that as her skill itself.
Right.
And, part of it is she's always been told that she is the hands part of the operation, right? She's the person who makes the technology go, makes the robots and everything operate. But, the truth of the matter is that her personality with regards to utilizing those skills and with the way that she interacts with the people who support her has given her a support structure that she's not really aware of. Right. She looks at her rival who, has people sort of regularly walk off the set, right? Or regularly walk off her team because she's such a nightmare to work with. And that's not a problem that Helen runs into. So she doesn't really get her head around it, around why that would be happening, right? She just thinks that it's bad luck. It's a bad mix. They haven't just gelled properly yet, that kind of thing. But the truth is that Helen's arrangement is more unusual because she does what she does, and she is grateful for the support that she has, and she works with the people she has, as opposed to, I'm the top dog. You will do what I tell you.
Right.
So.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to put it over to Paul for a minute.
Sure. This be a question that I was expecting Juliet to ask anyway, given Juliet's interests, and well, it's mine too. So, what is the role of language in terms of either languages on this colony or technical jargon, argot, technical terms, insider baseball? How do you use language and the use of languages in the novel?
I have an unfortunate addiction to acronym salad. So really the language that we get in the novel is actually very softened. Both tech and the military like their terminology. And one of the interesting things I've noticed over time is the repurposing of language in technology. As I mentioned, you referred to it as Ansible. I know it is telepresence or virtual reality. These words sort of define a feeling. They set an impression in your head of what it's going to be like. And since I'm working with a world that could very well be cyberpunk, because of the corporatism, because of the sort of aggressive structure of the chair system, all of these things could lean very cyberpunk if I was not careful with the language. So I tried to be very careful with the terminology and lean it much more towards sort of corporate speak, much more towards I'm even going to say a popular science level of speak, as opposed to letting it drift off into cyberpunk or letting it drift off into hardcore space opera. So the language in this case is really chosen to keep us in one kind of genre, one subset of the genre. And it sort of reflects the way that this universe works.
And one that's the road less taken. I mean, there's even today cyberpunks of dime a dozen, and you have plenty of hard or quasi hard space opera. Look at The Expanse. So yeah, to come from a corporate mindset, a corporate linguistic point of view is an interesting choice to present your novel. I like that idea.
Mm-hmm.
Well, get me a copy.
Yeah, well, and it's a sort of a clear space where I think I can define it. there are, you know, other writers out there who sort of write from this point of view. If you look at guys like Eric Nyland's done it a bit, especially the work he was doing with the Halo books, although he leans a little more militaristic. You look at Daniel Suarez, who really leans into corporate culture, very hardcore, but he leans in that more hard-edged thriller, verging on cyberpunk fashion. And I haven't seen too many people do it from sort of this, you know, tech-driven corporate speak angle. And I felt it was a way to make it more accessible to people who might not want to, or might not appreciate the grittiness of something like Suarez's works, or, you know, might be looking for something a little more different than the militaristic future that you get in a lot of Nyland's work. So,
you know, what's interesting is the way that you're talking about this is reminding me of Kelly Robson's Gods, Monsters, and the Lucky Peach. Did you ever read that?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's not at all the same because it's a totally different world and a totally different type of thing.
Sure.
But the way that corporatism is treated in a sort of unusual, not strictly cyberpunk and not strictly space opera. I think the biggest sort of beaten track that you would be in danger of falling into is the cyberpunk Philip K. Dick corporatism, right?
Right.
I think that's probably the most familiar to the most readers. And so it's interesting to see it done in different ways. I really think that your work is very different from Kelly Robson's work, but it's interesting to have those as two examples of people who are really saying, let's do corporatism in a totally different way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the balance between the corporate and the technological in your work is really, really interesting. And it's right at the core of the main conflict in the story. So
Right.
It's fun because it has, not only does it have that as a feature, but it's also like part of the deliberate focus of what the book is about, which is very cool.
Thank you.
Is there anything else you want to tell us about, tell listeners about the book?
So it's, you know, it was originally intended to be closer to a space opera, and it evolved into something else. Where my marketing team is calling it a VR opera, because we are really leaning into this idea that, you know, sort of extending human capabilities through technology as an interesting path forward. And by technology, I'm not necessarily talking about things like giant robots, but sort of more human scale technology and things that make the world a little bit simpler, or a little bit, you know, make your path through the world a little bit easier just on the individual human scale, which is, you know, sort of where a lot of the tech I deal with comes into play. And so, you know, I'm hopefully I've managed to sort of bridge that gap between, you know, the phone on your wrist and, you know, being able to drive robots in space, you know, a couple hundred years from now.
And I have to tell you, I love the phrase that they put on the cover of the book. Do you have the cover of the book that you can show us?
I have it. You know what? I don't have a physical copy of it, but I do have, one second. I believe I do have it in my personal portable pocket device. Because the supercomputer in my pocket, right?
Yep.
One sec. Of course, the problem with searching for the name of my book is that you get all of this science stuff.
Yeah.
All right, so here is the cover.
Oh, nice.
It's really pretty.
It turned out very cool. And the phrase on the front is "We are live, we are live, we are live," and that's the sort of the call, the call phrase or the catchphrase when you first connect, when you make your first connection and you've gotten everything up and running and you've successfully paired with your Waldo. And the fact that it's repeated multiple times is so that the people back home can tell it wasn't a fluke. Right, you're saying it 3 times. You're saying it clearly, just in case there's something off with the communication line, but also that you're capable of repeating it, which means that the transfer was a success, basically. So it's said. It is actually said every time you make the connection. We don't do it every time in the book because about halfway through the book, you're like, okay, fine, we've heard this before 27 times. But essentially, it is a phrase that they say every time that the connection to a Waldo is made. So it's a fairly important bit of terminology.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
And it has cool implications.
Yes, it does.
It's double entendre.
That's right.
Which is fun, which is super fun. Well, this has been really fun, Kimberly, and I'm so glad I had a chance to interview you.
Thank you.
This book
When is
again,
that book out again?
it comes out on November 13th.
Yep.
It's from Tachyon Press.
It is.
And it's just going to be really, really cool. And
you can pre-order it on Amazon.
Yeah.
The orders are love.
That's right. Because
Pre-orders
everything.
are love. Pre-order it now. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing it.
Awesome.
What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take us off live. I think we're just sort of doing what we can in terms of continuing the show during the COVID lockdown. And so I will be in touch with folks about next week, closer to next week.
Sounds good.
But thank you so much, and we'll stop the live stream.